continuation of Chris's motorcycle. Gearbox is still a work in progress. We're still waiting some parts to come from overseas, but I've got some time today. I'm going to pull the clutch out, pull the flywheel off, check the rear main seal, make sure the seal's not leaking either on the outside or the inside. I think it may have already been replaced once, going by the documentation. Thinking, yes. But I'm going there to have a look anyway because there's a lot of work to go back. So that's what I'm going to do now. Just put a little marker in the clutch pressure plates prior to taking it apart. Looks like the original clutch friction plate is the date stamp of the first month, 1986. Somebody's been here, they've just cleaned it up and just cleaned it up with some emery paper for whatever reason. I think he said it was sitting around for a while. If you're a real tight ass, you could put that back in there. I wouldn't do it because I know that where it's sprung apart slightly there can cause an issue where you pull the clutch in to disengage it. It's still a little bit sprung and it can drag along this and make selecting neutral difficult when you're stationary at the lights or whatever the case might be. It would probably measure up with the inspec, but I still wouldn't use it, honestly. Well, look at that. That's very wet with oil. And I didn't sort of expect to see that because that's the update seal. Customer said no expense spared, so not fussed.
No, I didn't.
Not the easiest thing to explain, but you've got your crankshaft main bearing and you've got two shims either side of it, which determines the end float of the crankshaft. They just sort of sit on two pins. If the crankshaft gets pushed forward towards the front of the motorcycle, the shim can get stuck to the crank and pull it with it. And if it does, then it can drop down and then it won't line up to the two pins, like when you try and put it back in place. That is if you actually realise what you've done. So you've got to be careful you don't lock the crankshaft forward when you're doing any work with the flywheel unbolted. Because when the flywheel's bolted up through the crankshaft boss, that then determines effectively the gap of what the crankshaft runs, and the shim sits snug in between that. When one side is missing, the crank will just shift all the way forward, and that's when you can run into trouble. More so if you do that and you don't realise and you bolt the flywheel back up, you'll damage the thrust washer or the shim that's between the crankshaft and the engine block, and the engine won't turn over. If you've done that, then you've got its engine out, heads off, barrels off, conrods out, timing chain out, crankshaft out, and then replace the shim to the size that you need. If you're really unlucky and the shim does drop out of place and you do manage to realise it, and you can't get it back in, at worst you take off the right cylinder and you, with a bit of luck and some long screwdrivers and some patience, you'll be able to work that shim back into place, push the crank backwards and then reassemble it back in. Like I said, if you don't realise you've done it, bolt that flywheel down, the engine will be frozen, it won't turn over, and you've done lots of damage to the inside of the engine that you're not going to be able to overcome without doing all that work to replace it. See that gold thing there? This piece.
Oh, yeah.
That's the thrust shim. There's one on the other side. So now, nothing's stopping that crankshaft from getting pushed forward, because this piece here, that's where the thrust shim goes up against this surface, and then the flywheel bolts to all of this. So with this out, nothing stopping that crank from going forward. If that shim gets stuck to the crank, and they frequently will do because of the oil that it's sitting in, it can come straight back. You might get lucky and pull the crank straight back if you do manage to knock it forward and go straight back onto the pegs. But if it drops, or if you rotate the crank while it's in that state where it's forward and it no longer lines up, you're gonna have a bit of trouble trying to get that to line back up to put it together. And if you can't do it just by turning the crank and pulling it back, and luck is on your side and it hasn't moved, you might get away with it. But if you don't and you can't do it, right cylinder has to come off at a minimum to reposition that shim back into place. So, and like I said, even that'll take a little bit of manipulation to do that. I'd say somebody not that long ago has been there, because it's quite clean in here. There's not like full of clutch dust and stuff. So, but I don't know why they've gone wrong there. They probably did what the instructions said and soaked the seal in oil, which all it does is leak. When they go to do the oil pump, you'll get a little bit of dribble of oil coming out of that. But that's a big deal, just wipe it up with a rag. But as long as when you clean it, you don't want to get that stuff inside of the engine. And with these in place, you won't get the cleaning, either of the cleaning solutions or dirt inside the engine if these are still in situ. Now I'll take these out, clean them individually, pull the remote seal out, and if there's nothing really else to be cleaned, just wipe that inside of where the seal recess goes. Peel that out, and quite often you do get a bit of dirt build up inside of these, which you need to clean out before you put the new O-ring in there. See all that?
Yeah, it's quite dirty.
Yep. This one is not the worst one I've seen. This one's usually a lot worse than this. Tells me it's been done probably once already. But I'll give that a good scrub in the parts washer and get all that muck out. Get like a wire brush into this as well, but you don't want to put that new O-ring you've got on top of all this rubbish. Okay, now I'm just removing that oil pump cover. Okay, we just have a look at the oil pump gears, make sure they're not too badly knocked around. I'll put them back in shortly and I'll measure the clearance. We're looking for a 0.2mm maximum clearance between the rotor tip and the rotor in its installed state. So when it's installed in the engine, it should be a maximum of 0.2mm. There are some reasonable scoring marks on this pump rotor. From something going through it at some time or another in its life. I'll have a good look at the housing. There's even a bit of a ridge where it's worn it down. That O-ring is almost flattened right off. Even though it wasn't leaking, there is just, that O-ring is hardly protruding at all. And if we had left it, it obviously wasn't leaking now, but I don't think it would have been far off from possibly becoming an issue, because there's not much there at all. I mean, there are some surface scratches there in the aluminium. It's certainly not the end of the world. But I'm going to have a look at the in this chamber here. So the one that's on the left side of the engine. This is the pressure side, and this is the suction side. So this is where the oil is drawn up from the sump, pressurized through the pump. So this is the pressure side, and then that feeds the main bearing, big end bearings, and all the oil galleries. Before it goes there, it goes to the oil filter, and then it feeds the main bearings and big end bearings and so forth, except for a tiny little hole drilled in the bottom of that chamber. It's a tiny little jet hole, and that sprays oil onto the cam followers and camshaft. So it's like an unfiltered oil supply to the camshaft on these things. So it's just the way they've always been. But when we do get some metal debris, like we've seen on that pump, because something has gone through there at some time, it can block up that oil gallery, and then we get an oil starvation issue to the cam followers, and then we see failure of the cam followers, and then the camshaft thereafter. It's a tiny little hole, so I've got to get in there with a mirror, bright light, and a bit of wire, and basically poke my way around until I find the hole. So I'm just going to poke that with a bit of stainless steel tie wire, see if it pushes through. Like a little stone, so the oil gallery is very small, and that was in the hole, it's stuck in the hole. Obviously didn't push through, it sort of came out once I poked around there with a bit of wire. Okay, it's definitely clear now, because that bit of wire is going straight into towards the cam followers. For those who remember the special tools thing that we did, about to use the rear main seal pulling tool. Basically this bolts the back of the engine block, this goes in through there, hooks behind the seal and literally just drags it out of place. And all those marks that you saw around the casing, that's something with a screwdriver trying to get it out. So obviously that's the non-damage way. There's marks on this casing, which there are, so if you run your finger you can feel there's a high spot where the seal would run. So they've actually, all that is a spot where it can leak oil, where they've put that mark. So I've got to go around there with a deburring tool. No big deal, I just put a new shampoo on the edge. So and just run the deburring tool and take all those burrs off. So when you knock the new seal in, it'll cut the outside edge of the seal as you knock it in, and then the oil can leak through it. That there is the thrust washer that's on the outside. There's one of those on the other side between the crankshaft and this engine block. That's what you don't want falling out of place on the inside, because that's a whole lot of grief if that happens, and a whole lot more grief if you don't realise it's happening. It's just literally a thrust washer. The two holes is where it's what it sits on. It's not bolted down or anything like that. And as easy as that came off, the only thing sort of holding on was sort of the engine oil behind it. And it's the same on the inside. So if you hit that crank forward when you tap in your rear main seal, and that shim goes this and then drops down, and then the pins won't line up. If you don't realise and bolt that crank up, you'll push those pins through this, you damage this, and the crankshaft won't turn. It'll just be frozen solid. If in doubt, pull the front engine cover off and get somebody or a friend or whatever to hold the alternator rotor forward or push it backwards and counteract that motion, because it's the same piece. The end of the alternator rotor attaches to the front of the crankshaft, and that's what's trying to go that direction. So if you've got somebody there to hold it back, or if you want to get really elaborate and make it a little bracket and bolt it to the engine with an adjustable screw or something. You put these back in, so they just literally sit on those two pins. That's it. In fact, you can see that it's moving around just on the oil that's there. So you can see how easy they can fall off. So we're looking at probably 18, probably slightly less if it was right on the tip. It's fine. Oh, no, we can put that back in. So still be clean. That's probably about it today, Chris.
Yeah.
Because the next bit's just all boring cleaning.
Cleaning.
So